Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I and Lord Ganesha are reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And we just had a climactic scene in which Mr. Slope, the chaplain, the new chaplain for the Bishop of Barchester, seemed to win a round against Mrs. Proudie, his now declared enemy, for control over the diocese. And this has led to a feeling in Mr. Slope that we would call feeling his oats. He is feeling invincible. And this has two effects that we're going to read in this chapter, because he has two different parts of his brain that are not connected with power plays in Barchester Close. One involves the wealthy widow Eleanor Bold, who has £1,000 of her own money a year and is very beautiful. And the other involves Signora Neroni, Madeline Neroni, the daughter of Dr. Vesey Stanhope, who is a member of the clergy in Barchester. She is also beautiful, but it's a very different kind of beauty. And she's also lame. She's confined to a couch and likes manipulating men, whereas Eleanor Bold, we are told, is as innocent as her little Johnny Bold, her little baby. Mr. Slope has his designs on both these women. And it's just up to the reader at this point to wonder how much he's deluding himself. And that is what this next chapter is all about. This next chapter, chapter 27, is called A Love Scene. And I'll give you a little spoiler. There's not a single particle of love anywhere in this chapter. That's going to bother Lord Ganesha, who's rather fond of the ladies. Anyway, this is a love scene. Mr. Slope, as we have said, left the palace with a feeling of considerable triumph. Not that he thought that his difficulties were all over. He did not so deceive himself, but he felt that he had played his first move well as the pieces on the board would allow, and that he had nothing with which to reproach himself. He first of all posted the letter to the Archbishop, and having made sure that he proceeded to push the advantage which he had gained. Had Mrs. Bold been at home, he would have called on her, but he knew that she was at Plumstead, so he wrote the following note. It was the beginning of what he trusted might be a long and tender series of epistles. My dear Mrs. Bold, you will understand perfectly that I cannot at present correspond with your father. I heartily wish that I could, and hope the day may not be long distant, when mists shall have cleared away and we will know each other. But I cannot preclude myself from the pleasure of sending you these few lines to say that Mr. Q, that is Mr. Quiverful, has today in my presence resigned any title he ever had to the wardenship of the hospital, and that the bishop has assured me that it is his intention to offer it to your esteemed father. Will you, with my respectful compliments, ask him, who I believe is now a fellow visitor with you, to call on the bishop either on Wednesday or Thursday between 10 and 1. This is by the bishop's desire. If you will so far oblige me to let me have a line naming either day, the hour which will suit Mr. Harding, I will take care that the servants shall be ordered to show him in without delay. Perhaps I should say no more, but still I wish you could make your father understand that no subject will be mooted between his lordship and him, which will refer at all to the method in which he is to choose to perform his duty. I, for one, am persuaded that no clergyman could perform it more satisfactorily than he did, or that he will do again. This is an allusion to the Sunday school and all of the other changes that Mr. Slope proposed that Mr. Harding would do in order to get the hospital back. Mr. Slope is now telling Eleanor Bold that I have been persuaded that that was all intemperate of me. On a former occasion, I was indiscreet and much too impatient, considering your father's age and my own. I hope you will not now refuse my apology. I still hope also that, with your aid and sweet pious labors, we may live to attach such a Sabbath school to the old endowment, as may, by God's grace and furtherance, be a blessing to the poor of this city. You will see at once that this letter is confidential. The subject, of course, makes it so. But equally, of course, it is for your parents' eye as well as for your own, should you think it proper to show him. I hope my darling little friend Johnny is as strong as ever, referring to the baby. Dear little fellow, does he still continue his rude assaults on those beautiful, long, silken tresses? I can assure you your friends miss you from Barchester sorely, but it would be cruel to begrudge you your sojourn among the flowers and fields during this truly sultry weather. Pray believe me, my dear Mrs. Bold, yours most sincerely, Obadiah Slope. The mention of tresses is that he walked in on Eleanor Bold when she was dangling her hair in front of the little baby who was pulling at her hair. A scene he shouldn't have seen. He should have announced himself and waited until he was admitted, but he barged in, and he has seen that, and that's what he's alluding to here. I want to keep in mind here with the letter, on the surface, Mr. Slope's letter is perfect. It does everything it should do. If it were written by a sincere person, it would be perfect. It would also be the end of the novel. He is not only saying that he was wrong to imperiously push on Mr. Harding all sorts of new conditions for the job. That's between him and the bishop, and it's for down the road. It's certainly not a requirement to him taking the job. But he's also saying that he has since come to realize that Mr. Harding is the best man for the job, beloved, pious, synonymous with the wardenship. And he's asking for an apology. He's apologizing. He's hoping that somewhere down the line Mr. Harding will forgive him. And he's also pointing out that the Sabbath Day School would be a help to the poor of the Diocese of Barchester. It certainly would be. I mean, don't think that the school being proposed here would be only for reciting prayers. It would be for learning letters, learning reading. The more advanced students who were poor, let's say the very youngest children of the Quiverfuls, could make enormous use out of such a school to help further them in their education, to get an education which would otherwise be denied to them. We have endless records of people for whom these kinds of Sunday schools were that effective. In other words, the whole letter is right. And yet not one word of it is sincere. So it doesn't matter. Now, this letter, taken as a whole, and with consideration that Mr. Slope wished to assume a great degree of intimacy with Eleanor, would not have been bad, but for the allusion to the tresses. Gentlemen do not write to ladies about their tresses unless they are on a very intimate terms indeed. But Mr. Slope could not be expected to be aware of this, because as Trollope is telling us over and over again, he's not a gentleman. He longed to put a little affection into his epistle, and yet he thought it injudicious, as the letter would, he knew, be shown to Mr. Harding. He would have insisted that the letter should be strictly private and seen by no eyes but Eleanor's own, had he not felt that such an injunction would have certainly been disobeyed. He therefore restrained his passion, did not sign himself yours affectionately, and contented himself instead with the compliment to the tresses. Having finished this letter, he took it to Mrs. Bold's home, and learning from the servant that things were to be sent out to Plumstead that afternoon, left with many injunctions in her hands. We will now follow Mr. Slope so as to complete the day with him, and then return to his letter and its momentous fate in the next chapter. There is an old song which gives us some very good advice about courting. It's good to be off with the old love before you're in with the new. Neither one of these are loves, but that's the point here. Of the wisdom of this maxim Mr. Slope was ignorant, and accordingly, having written his letter to Mrs. Bold, he proceeded to call upon Signora Neroni. Indeed, it was hard to say which was the old love and which was the new, Mr. Slope having been smitten with both so nearly at the same time. Perhaps he thought it now not amiss to have 2 strings to his bow, but 2 strings to Cupid's bow are always dangerous to him on whose behalf they are to be used. A man should remember that between 2 stools he may fall to the ground. But in sooth, Mr. Slope was pursuing Mrs. Bold in obedience to his better instincts, and the Signora in obedience to his worser. Had he won the widow and warned her, no one could have blamed him. You, O reader, and I, and Eleanor's other friends, would have received such story of a winning with much disgust and disappointment. But we should have been angry with Eleanor, not Mr. Slope. Bishop, male and female, dean and chapter and diocesan clergy in full Congress could have found nothing to disapprove of in such an alliance. Convocation itself, that mysterious and mighty synod, could in no wise have fallen foul of it. The possession of £1,000 a year and a beautiful wife would not at all have hurt the voice of a pulpit charmer or lessened the grace and piety of an exemplary clergyman. But not on such a nature were likely to be his dealings with the Signora Neroni. In the first place, he knew that her husband was living, and therefore he could not woo her honestly. Then again, she had nothing to recommend her to his honest wooing, had that been possible. She was not only portionless, but was also had the misfortune of being unfitted to be the chosen wife of any man who wanted a useful mate. Mr. Slope was aware that she was a helpless, hopeless cripple. But Mr. Slope could not help himself. He knew that he was wrong in devoting his time to the back drawing-room in Mr. Stanhope's house. He knew that what took place there would, if divulged, utterly ruin him with Mrs. Bold. He knew that scandal would soon come on his heels and spread among the black cloaks of Barchester some tidings, exaggerated tidings, of the sighs which he poured into the lady's ears. He knew that he was acting against the recognized principles of his life, against those laws of conduct by which he hoped to achieve much higher success. But as we have said, he could not help himself. Passion, for the first time in his life, passion was too strong for him. As for the Signora, no such plea can be put forward for her, for in truth she cared no more for Mr. Slope than she did for the 20 others who had been at her feet before him. She willingly, nay, greedily accepted his homage. He was the finest fly that Barchester had hitherto afforded to her web, and the signora was a powerful spider that had made wondrous webs and could in no way live without catching flies. Her taste in this respect was abominable, for she had no use for the victims when caught. She could not eat them matrimonially, as young lady flies do, whose webs are mostly those of their mothers weaving, nor could she devour them by any escapade of a less legitimate description. Her unfortunate affliction precluded her from all hope of levanting with a lover. She can't just get up and go to Bethnal Green. It would be impossible to run away with a lady who required 3 servants to move her from a sofa. The signora was subdued by no passion. Her time for love was gone. She had lived out her heart, such as heart she had ever had, in her early years, at an age when Mr. Slope was thinking of the second book of Euclid and his unpaid bill at the buttery hatch. In age, the lady was younger than the gentleman, but in feelings, in knowledge of the affairs of love, in intrigue, he was immeasurably her junior. It was necessary to her to have some man at her feet. It was the one customary excitement of her life. She delighted in the exercise of power which this gave her, and it was now nearly the only food for her ambition. She would boast to her sister that she could make a fool of any man, and her sister, as little imbued with feminine delicacy as herself, good-naturedly thought it but fair that such amusement should be afforded to a poor invalid who was debarred from the ordinary pleasures of life. She could read. She could write a book. Although the passages like this do always make me wonder what Madeline Stanhope, or Madeline Neroni, was like before she was lamed. Is it her husband who actually crippled her? And if so, what was she like before then? What was she like when she was capable of love, or of human feelings of any kind? Or is it that, as Trollope has told us many times, the Stanhopes just aren't capable of that anyway? Hale and healthy or lame, they aren't capable of it anyway. They're a family of psychopaths. Mr. Slope was madly in love, but hardly knew it. The signora spitted him as a boy does a cockroach on a cork, that she might enjoy the energetic agony of his gyrations, and she knew very well what she was doing. Mr. Slope, having added to his person all such adornments as are possible to a clergyman making a morning visit, such as a clean necktie, a clean handkerchief, new gloves, and a soupçon of not unnecessary scent, called about 3 o'clock at the doctor's door. At about this hour, the signora was almost always alone in the back drawing-room. The mother had not yet come down. The doctor was out or in his own room. Bertie was out, and Charlotte at any rate left the room if anyone called whose object was specifically her sister. Such was her idea of being charitable and sisterly. Mr. Slope, as was his custom, asked for Mrs. Stanhope, and was told, as was the servant's custom, that the signora was in the drawing-room. Upstairs he accordingly went. He found her, as he always did, lying on her sofa with a French volume before her and a beautiful little inlaid writing case open on her table. At the moment of his entrance she was in the act of writing. "Ah, my friend," said she, putting out her left hand to him across the desk, "I did not expect you today, and was this very instant writing to you." Mr. Slope, taking the soft, fair, delicate hand in his, and very soft and fair and delicate it was, bowed over it his huge red head and kissed it. It was a sight to see, a deed to record if the author could fitly do it, a picture to put on canvas. Mr. Slope was big, awkward, cumbrous, and having his heart in his pursuit, was ill at ease. The lady was fair, as we have said, and delicate. Everything about her was fine and refined. Her hand in his looked like a rose lying among carrots. And when he kissed it, he looked like a cow might find to finding such a flower among her food. She was grateful as a couchant goddess, and moreover as self-possessed as Venus must have been when courting Adonis. Oh, that such a grace and such a beauty should have condescended to waste itself on such a pursuit. "I was in the act of writing to you," said she, "but now my scrawl may go into the basket," and she raised the sheet of gilded notepaper from off her desk as though to tear it. "Indeed it shall not," said he, laying the embargo of half a stone weight of his human flesh and blood upon the devoted paper. "Nothing that you write from my eye, signora, shall be so desecrated." And he took up the letter and put it among the carrots, and fed on it, and then proceeded to read it. "Gracious me, Mr. Slope," said she, "I hope you don't mean to say that you keep all the trash I write to you. Half of my time I don't know what I write, and when I do, I know it is fit only for the back of the fire. I hope you do not have the ugly trick of keeping letters. At any rate, I don't throw them into the waste-paper basket. If destruction is to be their doomed lot, they perish worthily, and are burnt on a pyre, as was Dido of old." Dido from the Aeneid. "With a steel pen stuck through them, of course," said she, "to make the simile more complete. Of all the ladies of my acquaintance, I think Lady Dido was the most absurd. Why did she not do as Cleopatra did? Why did she not take out her ships and insist on going with him, meaning going with Aeneas? She would not bear to lose the land she had got by a swindle, and then she could not bear the loss of her lover. So she fell between two stools. Mr. Slope, I hope, whatever you do, never mingle love and business. Mr. Slope blushed up to his eyes, and over his mortified forehead to the very roots of his hair. He felt sure that the Signora knew all about his intentions with reference to Mrs. Bold. His conscience told him that he was detected. His doom was to be spoken. He was to be punished for his duplicity and rejected by the beautiful creature before him. Poor man! He little dreamt that had all his intentions with reference to Mrs. Bold been known to the Signora, it would only have added zest to the lady's amusement. It was all very well to have Mr. Slope at her feet, to show her power by making an utter fool of a clergyman, to gratify her own infidelity by thus proving the little strength which religion had in controlling the passions of even a religious man. But it would be increased gratification if she could be made to understand that she was at the same time alluring her victim away from another, whose love, if she could, would be every way beneficial and salutary. The Signora had indeed discovered with a keen instinct of such a woman that Mr. Slope was bent on matrimony with Mrs. Bold. But in alluding to Dido, she had not thought of it. She instantly perceived, however, from her lover's blushes, what was on his mind, and was not slow in taking advantage of it. I want to point out, these are both horrible people. This is a long conversational scene between two horrible people. We'll get to that at the end. She looked him full in the face, not angrily, nor yet with a smile, but with an intense and overpowering gaze. And then holding up her forefinger and slightly shaking her head, she said, "Whatever you do, my friend, do not mingle love and business. Either stick to your treasure and your city of wealth, or else follow your love like a true man. But never tempt both. If you do, you'll have to die with a broken heart, as did poor Dido. What is it to be with you, Mr. Slope? Love or money?" Mr. Slope was not ready with a pathetic answer, as he usually was when touching episodes of his extempore sermons. He felt that he ought to say something pretty, something also that should remove the impression on the mind of his lady-love, but he was rather put out about how to do it. "Love," said he, true overpowering love, must be the strongest passion a man can feel. It must control every other wish and put aside every other pursuit. But with me, love will never act in that way unless it be returned." And he threw upon the Signora a look of tenderness which was intended to make up for all the deficiencies of his speech. "Take my advice," said she. "Never mind love. After all, what is it? The dream of a few weeks. That is all its joy. The disappointment of a life is its nemesis. Who was ever successful in true love? Success in love argues that the love is false. True love is always despondent or tragical. Juliet loved, Haidee loved, Dido loved, and what came of it? Troilus loved and ceased to be a man. Not sure how many of these literary references are landing. I'm not sure how many of them landed with Trollope's audience. Don't worry about it, though. You know what's being said here. Troilus loved and was fooled, said the more manly chaplain. A man may love and yet not be a Troilus. All women are not Cressids. No, all women are not Cressids. The falsehood is not always on the woman's side. Imogen was true, but how was she rewarded? Her lord believed her to be the paramour of the first he came near him in his absence. Desdemona was true and was smothered. Ophelia was true and was driven mad. There is no happiness in love, except at the end of an English novel. We're reading that from a character of Trollope, and yet we can guarantee it. Almost guarantee it. There are only a couple of Trollope novels where it doesn't happen. That's a great line. There is no happiness in love except at the end of an English novel. That deserves to be pulled out and put in a commonplace book. But in wealth, money, houses, lands, goods and chattels, in all the good things of this world, yes, in them there is something tangible, something that can be retained and enjoyed. "Oh, no," said Mr. Slope, feeling himself bound to enter some protest against so unorthodox a doctrine. "This world's wealth will make no one happy." "And what will make you happy? You. You," she said, raising herself up and speaking to him with energy across the table. "From what source do you look for happiness? Do not say that you look say that you look for none. I shall not believe you. It is a search in which every human being spends an existence." "And the search is always in vain," said Mr. Hope, "for we have happiness on earth while we ought to be content for the hope of it in heaven." "Pshaw! You preach a doctrine which you do not believe. It is all the way with you all. If you know that there is no earthly happiness, why do you long to be a bishop or a dean? Why do you want lands and income? I have the natural ambition of a man. Of course you have, and the natural passions, and therefore I say that you don't believe the doctrine you preach. St. Paul was an enthusiast. He believed that his ambition and passion did not war against his creed. So does the Eastern fanatic who passes away half his life erect on a pillar. As for me, I will believe in no belief that does not make itself manifest by outward sign. I will think no preaching sincere that is not recommended by the practice of the preacher. Mr. Slope was startled and horrified, but he felt that he could not answer. How could he stand up and preach a lesson of his master with a capital M, being there as he was on the devil's business? He was a true believer, otherwise this would have been nothing to him. He had audacity for most things, but he had not audacity to make a plaything of the Lord's word. All this the Signora understood and felt with much interest as she saw her cockroach whirl round upon her pin. Your wit delights in such arguments, said he, but your heart and your reason do not go along with them. My heart? You quite mistake the principles of my composition if you imagine that there is such a thing about me. After all, there is very little that was false in anything that the Signora said. If Mr. Slope had allowed himself to be deceived, it was his own fault. Nothing could have been more open than her declarations about herself. The little writing table with her desk was still standing before her, a barrier, as it were, against the enemy. She was sitting as nearly upright as she ever did, and he had brought a chair close to the sofa so that there was only the corner of the table between him and her. It so happened that as she spoke, her hand lay upon the table, and as Mr. Slope answered her, he put his hand upon hers. No heart, said he. That is a heavy charge which you bring against yourself, and one of which I cannot find you guilty. She withdrew her hand, not quickly or angrily, as though insulted by his touch, but gently and slowly. You are in no condition to give a verdict on the matter, said she, as you have not yet tried me. No, don't say that you intend doing so, for you know you have no intention of the kind, nor indeed have I either. As for you, you will take your vows where they will result in something more substantial than the pursuit of a ghost-like, ghastly love such as mine. Your love should be sufficient to satisfy the dream of a monarch, said Mr. Slope, not quite clear as to the meaning of his words. Say an archbishop, Mr. Slope, said she. Poor fellow. She was very cruel to him. He went round and round again on his cork on the allusion to his profession. He tried, however, to smile, and gently accused her of joking on a matter which was, he said, to him of such vital moment. Why, what gulls you men make of us! How you fool us at the top of our bent, and of all the men you clergymen are the most fluent in your honeyed, caressing words. Now look me in the face, Mr. Slope, boldly and openly. Mr. Slope did look at her with a languishing, loving eye. As he did so, he again put forth his hand to get hold of hers. I told you to look at me boldly, Mr. Slope, but confine your boldness to your eyes. Oh, Madeline. Well, my name is Madeline, but none except my family usually call me so. Now look me in the face, Mr. Slope. Am I to understand that you say you love me? Mr. Slope had never said so. If he had come there with any formed plan at all, his intention was to make love to the lady without uttering such a declaration. It was, however, quite impossible that he should now deny his love. He had, therefore, nothing for it but to go down on his knees distractedly against the sofa and swear that he did love her with a love passing the love of man. The Signora received the assurance with little palpitation or appearance of surprise. Now answer me another question. When are you to be married to my dear friend Eleanor Bold? Poor Mr. Slope went round and round in mortal agony. In such a condition as his, it was really very hard for him to know what answer to give. And yet no answer would have been his surest condemnation. He might as well at once plead guilty to the charge brought against him. Why do you accuse me of such dissimulation? Dissimulation? I said nothing of dissimulation. I made no charge against you, and I make none. Pray don't defend yourself to me. You swear that you are devoted to my beauty, and yet you are on the eve of matrimony with another. I feel this to be rather a compliment. It is to Mrs. Bold that you must defend yourself, that you may find difficult, unless indeed you can keep her in the dark. You clergymen are cleverer than other men. Signora, I have told you that I love you, and now you rail at me? Rail at you? God bless the man, what would he have? Come, answer me this at your leisure, not without thinking now, but leisurely and with consideration. Are you not going to be married to Mrs. Bold? I am not, said he, and as he said it, he almost hated with an exquisite hatred the woman whom he could not help loving with an exquisite love. She's just tormenting him. She gives him no out, nowhere to go. But surely you are a worshipper of hers? I am not, said Mr. Slope, to whom the word worshipper was peculiarly distasteful. The signora has conceived that it would be so. I wonder at that, said she. Do you not admire her? To my eye she is the perfection of English beauty, and then she is rich, too. I should have thought she was just the person to attract you. Come, Mr. Slope, let me give you advice on this matter. Marry the charming widow. She will be a good mother to your children, and an excellent mistress of a clergyman's household. Oh, signora, how can you be so cruel? Cruel, said she, changing the tone of banter which she had been using for one which was expressly earnest in tone. Is that a cruelty? How can I love another while my heart is entirely your own? If that were cruelty, Mr. Slope, then what might you say of me if I were to declare that I returned your passion? What would you think if I bound you, even by a lover's oath, to do a daily penance at this couch of mine? What can I give you in return for a man's love? Ah, dear friend, you have not realized the conditions of my fate. Mr. Slope was not on his knees all this time. After his declaration of love, he had risen from them as quickly as he thought consistent with the new position which he now filled, and as he stood was leaning on the back of his chair. This outburst of tenderness on the part of Signora's part quite overcame him, and made him feel for the moment that he could sacrifice everything to be assured of the love of a beautiful creature before him, maimed, lame, and already married as she was. And can I not sympathize with your lot? Said he, now seating himself on the sofa and pushing away the table with his foot. Sympathy is so near to pity, she said. If you pity me, cripple as I am, I shall spurn you from me. Oh, Madeline, I will only love you. And again he caught her hand and devoured it with kisses. Now she did not withdraw it from him, but sat there as he kissed it, looking at him with her great eyes, just as a spider would look at a great fly that is quite securely caught. Suppose Signor Neroni were to come to Barchester, she said. Would you make his acquaintance? Signor Neroni? You practically see Slope looking around like, is he going to jump out at me? Would you introduce him to the bishop and Mrs. Proudie and the young ladies? Said she, again having recourse to that horrible quizzing voice which Mr. Slope so particularly hated. Why do you ask such a question? Because it is necessary that you should know that there is a Signor Neroni. I think you had forgotten it. If I thought you retained for that wretch one particle of the love which he never was worthy, I would die before I would distract you by telling you what I feel. No, were your husband the master of your heart, I might perhaps love you, but you should never know it. My heart again, how you talk. And you consider then, if a husband be not master of his wife's heart, he has no right to her fealty. If a wife ceases to love, she may cease to be true. Is that your doctrine on this matter, as a minister of the Church of England? Mr. Slope tried hard within himself to cast off the pollution which he felt he was defiling his soul. A little bit late for that, Obadiah. He strove to tear himself away from the noxious siren that had bewitched him, but he could not do it. He could not be again heart-free. He had looked for rapturous love in loving this lovely creature, and he had already found that he had met with little but disappointment and self-rebuke. He had come across the fruit of the Dead Sea, so sweet and delicious to the eye, so bitter and nauseous to the taste. He had put the apple to his mouth, and it had turned to ashes between his teeth. Yet he could not tear himself away. He knew, he could not help but know, that she jeered at him, ridiculed his love, and insulted the weakness of his religion. But she half permitted his adoration, and that half permission added such fuel to his fire that all the fountains of his piety could not quench it. He began to feel savage, irritated, revengeful. He meditated some severity of speech, some truant that would cut her, as her taunts had cut him. He reflected as he stood there for a moment, silent before her, that if he desired to quell her proud spirit, he should do so by being prouder than even herself. That if he wished to have her at his feet, suppliant for his love, it behooved him to conquer her by indifference. All this passed through his mind. As far as dead knowledge went, he knew, or thought he knew, how a woman should be tamed. But when he essayed to bring his tactics to bear, he failed like a child. What chance has dead knowledge with the experience of any of the transactions between man and man? What possible chance between man and woman? Mr. Slope loved furiously, insanely, and truly, but he had never played the game of love. The Signora did not love at all, but she was up to every move on the board. And so she continued to insult him, and he continued to bear it. "Sacrifice the world for love," said she, in answer to some renewed, vapid declaration of his passion. "How often has the same thing been said, and how invariably with the same falsehood?" "Falsehood? Do you say that I am false to you? Do you say that my love is not real?" "False? Of course it is false. False as the father of falsehood. If indeed falsehood need a sire, and are not self-begotten since this world began. Are you ready to sacrifice the world for love? Come, let us see what you will sacrifice. I care nothing for nuptial vows. The wretch, I think you were kind enough to call him so, whom I swore to love and obey, is so base that he can only be thought of with repulsive disgust. In the council chamber of my heart, I have divorced him. To me, that is as good as though aged lords had gloated for months over the details of my licentious life. I care nothing for what the world can say. Will you be as frank? Will you take me to your home as your wife? Will you call me Mrs. Slope before bishop, dean, and prebendaries?" The poor tortured wretch stood silent, not knowing what to say. "What? You won't do that? Tell me then, what part of the world is it that you're willing to sacrifice for my claims? For my charms, sorry." She's throwing in his face a line that Trollope hasn't given us to hear. He has said something like, "I would sacrifice the whole world for your love." And she's showing him that he isn't willing to sacrifice almost anything for her charms. Were you free to marry, I would take you to my house tomorrow and wish no higher privilege." "I am free," said she, almost starting up in her energy. For though there was no truth in her pretended regard for her clerical admirer, there was a mixture of real feeling in the scorn and satire with which she spoke of love and marriage generally. "I am free, free as the winds. Come, will you take me as I am? Have your wish. Sacrifice the world and prove yourself a true man." What, specifically, is she asking him to do right now? Mr. Slope should have taken her at her word. She would have drawn back, and he would have had the full advantage of the offer. But he did not. Instead of doing so, he stood wrapped in astonishment, passing his fingers through his lank red hair, and thinking as he stared upon her animated countenance that her wondrous beauty grew more and more wonderful as he gazed on it. The narrator is telling us that he should have made it try for it. She would have refused, but at least he'd have then had the offer. They'd have both had to live with that. We'll get to that when we talk about it at the end. "Ha!" she laughed out loud. "Come, Mr. Slope, don't talk of sacrificing the world again. People beyond 1 and 20 should never dream of such a thing. You and I, if we have the dregs of any love left in us, if we have the remnants of any passion remaining in our hearts, should husband our resources better. We are not in the prime of our youth. The world is a very nice place. Your world, at any rate, is so. You have all manner of fat rectories to get, and possible bishoprics to enjoy. Come, confess, on second thoughts, you would not sacrifice such things for the smiles of a lame lady." It was impossible for him to answer this. In order to be in any way dignified, he felt that he must be silent. "Come," said she, "don't booty with me. Don't be angry because I speak out some home truths. Alas, the world, as I have found it, has taught me some bitter truths. Come, tell me that I am forgiven. Are we not to be friends?" And she again put out her hand to him. He sat himself down in the chair beside her and took her proffered hand and leant over it. "There," said she, with her sweetest, softest smile, a smile to withstand which a man should be cased in triple steel. "There, there, seal your forgiveness on it," and she raised it towards his face. He kissed it again and stretched over her as though desirous of extending the charity of her pardons beyond the hand which was offered to him. She managed, however, to check his ardor. For one so easily allured as this poor chaplain, her hand was surely enough. "Oh, Madeline, tell me that you love me. Do you love me?" "Hush," said she. "There is my mother's step. Our tete-a-tete has been of monstrous length. Now you had better go, but we shall see you soon after, shall we not?" Mr. Slope promised that he would again call on the following day. "And, Mr. Slope," she continued, "pray answer my note. You have it in your hand, though I declare during these 2 hours you have not been gracious enough to read it. It is about the Sabbath school and the children. You know how anxious I am to have them here. I've been learning the catechism myself on purpose. You must manage it for me next week. I will teach them at any rate to submit themselves to their spiritual pastors and masters." Horrible. Absolutely horrible. Mr. Slope said but little on the subject of the Sabbath schools, but he made his adieu and betook himself home with a sad heart, troubled mind, and uneasy conscience. And that is called a love scene. Trollope calls that a love scene. And that is, I think, a really good bellwether of why Victorian readers flocked to these books. It's not going to seem it. It's clothed in 100-year-old language. It's, an antiquated love scene. Nobody does love scenes like these in modern novels, but nothing like that had ever come across the normal lender at Moody's library before in the history of English literature. Nothing like that scene. That is a scene of horrible truths and horrible lies spoken between two horrible, empty people at length. It's not that we're bidden by the author sort of tacitly to dislike these people, but they're kept at a distance so that the narrative focus can fall on virtuous characters. Instead, we don't get any interruptions. It's just a scene between a woman who cannot love and a man who does not love. Both of them lying on multiple levels the whole time. It's electrifying, but it's not what the ladies were expected to read in their Victorian novels, especially those that were being serialized. It was not that at all. This is Anthony Trollope. This is well known. This is the second book of his dealing with the high politics of a cathedral town. A scene like this has no more place in a story like that than a hippo does at the ballet. That's what makes it so exciting. That's what makes it so amazing. It does remind me, though, now that we're halfway through this book, it does remind me of some things that we're not getting. We haven't got a fox hunting scene yet, of course. Trollope isn't obliged to provide a fox hunting scene in every novel. But we also haven't so far got a lot of dramatic weight being placed on a character who's both complex and good. We have characters who are good, but they aren't complex. Mr. Harding is basically a pasteboard saint. His daughter, Eleanor Bold, is as innocent as her little baby, we're told. How much interest is there in that? There's no complexity in that. And we have plenty of complex evil people. But it's always a pleasure, it's an extra pleasure for me when Trollope does a complex good person. The closest that we've come in this narrative so far is Mr. Arabin, but we haven't had much of him. We've had scenes where he's involved, but not much that of the mechanics of storytelling where Trollope puts such a character into the vise of drama. Maybe that will happen as the story goes on with Mr. Arabin. Certainly the pieces are in place for it. But in the meantime, in this chapter, we get the exact opposite. We get a long dialogue between two horrible people. So there you go. That is our chapter for today. We will meet next time for the next chapter when we get the fate of that letter. The letter that Mr. Slope sent to Eleanor Bold at Plumstead Episcopi, at the home of his sworn enemy, Archdeacon Grantley, that tells her that the bishop has decided that Mr. Harding will go back into the wardenship. But it also makes love to her. It's going to seem very mild by our 21st century standards, but he mentions her long silken tresses. When she's a widow who's expressed no personal interest in him whatsoever, and he's a churchman. That letter is apparently going to be the grenade that goes off that we were told about chapters ago. We were told that in the course of one day at Plumstead Episcopi, everyone was going to go down to breakfast and be happy and chatty together. Something was going to happen, and at the end of that day, they wouldn't be able to stand the sight of each other. That letter, I assume, is going to be that thing. That's what we're being led to assume. So let's move on to see what happens next time, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.